Nope.
Okay. Ready?
Always.
In it? Huh? Okay. Okay. We left off last week. We were on our way getting to the din of Meisrim, but we started from Bezdin and Bezdin losing some of their powers, and Bezdin's provisional powers when they need them. So we left off with the story of Shimon ben Shetach and the time that Shimon ben Shetach lived in, and the act that Shimon ben Shetach did to stabilize Klal Yisrael, even though it didn't really match up with the procedural dinim of Bezdin. Now the thing is that Shimon ben Shetach lived in the time of Sanhedrin, though still. So ostensibly Shimon ben Shetach had the powers of Sanhedrin, and therefore, even though maybe he wasn't supposed to kill this many or in this fashion or etc., but he still had the powers of Sanhedrin. So let's move the ball a few more yards down the field, and we'll get to the part where it's mamash related to our times. So there's Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Chav Zayin, where the Gemara tells a story of about Bar Chama. The Gemara on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph says, Bar Chama katal nafsha. Bar Chama, whoever he was, killed somebody. So Amalei Reish Galusa Rabbi Yaakov, the Reish Galusa told the Rabbi Yaakov, Puk ayin bey, go do some research, do some digging. Ivadei katal, if he takav really killed somebody, l'kayu le'enei, poke out his eyes. So Asi Trei Sadi brought to Edim, and the Gemara brings it back and forth. And so Rashi tells us, the Reish Galusa lived clearly after the Churban was over. The Reish Galusa lived in Bavel. The Reish Galusa did not have a Sanhedrin. So Rashi tells us what's going on over here. So Rashi says, Yinakur Eseina poke out his eyes, the Batlu Mises Bezdin. Mises Bezdin no longer exists. V'hai Knasuhu, Avdinam Bey, the Bezdin Makin Vainshin Shalem and Atera. Rashi tells us this is the din. This is the same din from Shimon ben Shetach. This is the same din that even when there's no Bezdin, when there's no Musmachim, when it's not in Eretz Yisrael, still the din of Makin Vainshin Shalem and Atera, your Bezdin could still inflict a grievous einshim on people who are deserving of it. Now, the problem is that this Gemara says poke at his eyes. Now, poke at his eyes is painful, I'm sure, and terrible, but there's a big stretch from poking at someone's eyes to kill them. Poking at someone's eyes is inflicting, a very harmful einish, something that's going to last forever. It's very serious einish, but it isn't killing somebody. And based on this, some Rishonim, for example, the Muki Yosef and some Achronim, the Chachma Shleima and others, say the Medaik from this Gemara that yes, the din of Makan Vainshin Shalem and Atayra exists even when there's no din of Sanhedrin, but it only exists, limited. Bezdin, when there is no Sanhedrin, they can't kill someone. They could harm them. They could hurt them. This is what the Muki Yosef and the Chachma Shleima say. Muki Yosef actually says that it's on purpose. In order to show that Sanhedrin doesn't exist and that Sanhedrin's powers are gone, you could only do limited einshim. You can't really hurt someone in a bad way. Now, there's many Rishonim and many Achronim say this, but Lamaisa, the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch and the Rosh and the Rif and probably the Rambam all hold that this was just that was the circumstance. What the Reish Galusa asked for at that time was to poke at his eyes, but the Reish Galusa just as well could have asked for killing him, and it was within the Reish Galusa's power to inflict capital punishment as well. It wouldn't be limited at just saying poke at his eyes. And this is how the most of this is the Tzitz Eliezer in Chelik Yites has like a mini kuntris on the ideas of Makan Vayichin Shalem and Atayr Bizman Hazeh, like on applying it to today. And in there he brings all the different Rishonim and Machik different shitas. The Ma'aseh, the Shulchan Aruch, and most of the Gedei Achronim Paskin that even Bizman Hazeh means 500-600 years ago. Makan Vayichin Shalem and Atayr, a bezdin of some sort could punish people even by killing them when the din is not so. Ad Kedei Kach that the Maram Lublin has a tshuva where he writes as follows. He writes that he says as follows: Ein daiti noite lahanish ba'asaras evarim. I'm against chopping off limbs or eyes or stuff like this. I push for killing in a case where it's needed. He says why? Because because these people with their chopped off limbs are going to live still, and they're going to go. They'll convert. They'll tell the goyim about us. They'll spread the word that Jews are still punishing each other in this manner. He says, and that's going to end up leading to big problems. He says, like it happened in the early days of Polish Jewry, during the time of Rav Shachna, Shaya b'yamav gamkin ish blial v'roya malal. There was a bad guy. The hitter hagoyin. Rav Shalom Shachna was matir lenaker eshtei to poke out both his eyes, cut his tongue. And after they inflicted all these einshim on him, himir dasei v'nasa akum. He went off the derech. He married a guy. V'haylid b'nei zarim. V'hayuhu v'zarei hamariyim kol yemeim le'tzaras mirdus Yisrael. It says, in him and all his progeny spent the rest of their days, making trouble for Jews. Now, listen, I mean, if I was him, I think I'd probably go the same route. I can't blame him. But says in Ram Lublin, it's not a good method of punishment to leave someone who you really damaged and then just say, hey, you're out on your own. Now go live. Because that could lead to terrible repercussions. He says, in a case where it's justified, where Bezdin feels like, this guy crossed the line and we're going to employ the powers of Makan Vayjin Shalem and Atayra, so go all the way. This is how the Shulchan Aruch, for the most part, seems to pass. And now, at the end of this tshuva, the Tzitz Eliezer actually brings we spoke about it, I think, a few months ago, the Akedah, if anyone remembers, the Akedah that says that society, the Rabbanim can't let small things snowball. If you remember that, we spoke about it, I think when we spoke about Shabbos in America, we spoke about, drawing the line. Like the Akedah is a psak where you have to draw the line. So the Tzitz Eliezer at the end of this tshuva, although he's very well aware of the fact that in the modern era this certainly doesn't happen, not cutting off hands, arms, tongues, noses, or killing is not happening to Jews who are violating, the Teres Halachas. He gives like a Musar piece at the end where he brings the Akedah's famous piece that Rabbanim and Mamunim and people whose job it is to care for the stands of Klal Yisrael have to draw the line. And you have to be willing to go out and to draw the line. Now, again, I don't think this is passing Lamaisa, but, that's the tone that he ends off on. Now, Lamaisa today, I think as everyone can pretty much attest, this doesn't really hold water. This doesn't really apply, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with an idea that the Chazon Ish expresses in Yeridei and Siman Beis. The Chazon Ish says something on his own, meaning not from earlier sources. He says it on his own, and it's hard to know at exactly what moment in time it turned the way the Chazon Ish says that it is, but what the Chazon Ish says makes a lot of sense. Chazon Ish in Siman Beis says, V'nira, the ain din meiridin, this din of meiridin v'lei mailin, right? There's a din that if someone is a mummer and apikairis, if he's passing by a pit, shove him in a little and don't pick him up, right? Meiridin v'lei mailin. You help him go down, you don't help him come up. This is a din, and this is similar to the dinim of Makan Vayjin Shalem and Atayra, punishing people when it's not justified, and drawing the line, trying to draw. It says the Chazon Ish, the ain meiridin, this whole din, this whole segment of punishments. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashgacha was very well revealed in the world, when there was miracles, readily available, and Hashem was still communicating with Klal Yisrael through a baskel. And Tzadikei Hadar were under a hashgacha pratis that was visible to everybody. He says, he says, and then a kaifer in that time, who was living in such a tkufa, was imbued with like a special rishus, like a special desire to try to take Klal Yisrael off a cliff and to try to violate the rules and violate the standards, he says. And in such a time, at such a moment in time, eradicating Rishon from the world was maintaining status quo, was keeping the world in check, it was keeping Klal Yisrael in check. So Shakal Yadu, Hadar, may be Piranius, because everyone understood that if one or two people started straying and taking everybody off a cliff, it would lead to great downfall for everybody, La'ilam. Or maybe Dever V'charev V'rab La'ilam. Abu Bizmana Helam, he says, in a time of obfuscation, when Hashem's influence is not clear. He says, Shenikrasa Hamuna min Dalas Ha'am, Aim b'maisa hirada, and this is the punchline, he says, at a time when the Muna is not clear by people and you can't see Hashem's Yad very visibly, he says, not only is killing people and punishing people extra legally not a help, he says, it makes it worse. Observers, the general populace will see it and say, Kemaisa ashchasa. They'll say this is like vicious behavior, this is like outlandish behavior. A guy, he says he's Mechal Shem Shemayim and you kill him, like, hey, Tachan, how can you do something like that? He says, and says the Chazon Ish, since the whole purpose of this din is for the greater good, it's like to keep things stable, it's a greater good din. It says greater good dictates that in a time when there is no Gilei Hashchina and it's not so clear, that you can't do this anymore. Greater good goes the opposite way. says the only thing we could do is she'ein b'tikin v'aleinu l'achzirim b'avoises ha'ava. We're supposed to just be loving towards them. U'lahamidam b'keren oyer b'mashi yadeinu magas. Very 2012, very woke. It's time to be warm and loving and try to bring people in. He says to push people away in a hard fashion today is just going to lead to raised eyebrows. Just going to be people saying like what is that? That's extra. That's too much. Now it's very hard to say, and the Chazon Ish doesn't delineate exactly what point in time the Hanaga switches from that to this. It's clear to us that there's a point in time when it switches. It's hard to put a finger on it and say it happened this year, it happened then. I don't know exactly when. But what the Chazon Ish is expressing from without a source, mamash from a svara, is something that's nira le'in kol. It's something that makes sense. So now let's get to the one exception where till the very, very modern era, Einshim Wataka being meted out, and that's the sugi of a meiser. Now, just to start, the din that a meiser gets killed is really a Gemara for itself. The Gemara in Baba Kama and Daf Kufay Zayin says that there was someone who was engaged in a chesed mishpat machlekes with his friend, and he said that he was going to go turn over the case to the AG or to the local magistrate, and I think so. 1 second. He says. The Rav Amalek finds. He says he came in front of Rav and he says, "Don't do it." He says, "No, I'm gonna." So Yasser Rav Kahana kamed the Rav. Rav Kahana was sitting like a Talmud in front of Rav. All this happened. Shamte lekue minei. He took out his throat from him, which is a poetic way of saying he killed him. He took out his throat from him. Rav Kahana stood up and you're saying you're going to go. That's the end. So Kari Rav Alei Rav said a pasuk, Banecha Olfu, and then Rav tells him, but Lamaisa, the day and age doesn't allow for just wanton murder, so you better run and go away from it because the local government is not going to be okay with what you did. And Rav Kahana runs away. That's the Gemara. Now the Gemara seems to bring us a story, a Meiser Rav, that killing a Meiser, someone who says, I'm going to turn someone in, is allowed to be put to death. And without going into too much detail of it, this is how the Shulchan Aruch Taka Paskins. The Shulchan Aruch in Chesed Mishpat in Siman Shin Pei Ches Paskins muter laharag haMeiser b'chol makom. It's permitted to kill a Meiser in every place. Afilu b'zman hazeh, even in our time. Muter laharag kaidem sheyimser. Now the diik from the Gemara is that it's muter to kill a Meiser before he kills, but not as an einish, not as a punishment. Not once a Meiser goes and turns someone in, could you kill him like to punish him for doing it? You kill to prevent. It has like the din of a roidif. From Rav Kahana's story, you see Rav Kahana said, I see where this is going, let me stop it before it goes there. But after someone was Moshe to go and kill them, that not. Now, and this is whether the Meiser is giving over someone begufay, oibim amaynoi, you're allowed to kill the Meiser, but the Shulchan Aruch does stress that if the Meiser already did it, and it's not something that's preventative, then it could be, then probably you can kill him. Now, there is an exception. The Shulchan Aruch speaks out. And this is very broad strokes, and there's a lot of detail in each one of these things, but there is an exception. And that is someone who gets the title of a meiser. Meaning, there could be someone who gives someone over. In a moment of anger, he gives a case over. He did it. Okay, so someone committed an act of Masira. He did an act of Masira. You gave over another Jew to secular law. And then there's someone who's a meiser. Someone whose job description is a meiser, meaning he's a habitual meiser. This is what he does. He hangs around the kehila. He figures out what's going on, what's wrong, and he passes that information on to where he thinks it will cause the most damage and get him the most, usually, money and respect. Now, someone who's a meiser, so then that's a person that you could kill even before, after, later. That person gets the title of a meiser. Then it's a done deal. Now, that's the people that we're talking about, and there's been many cases of this. For example, All the places can make this. Again, it's a lot of nuance. Before you actually kill someone, let's talk again. Let's talk again because.
What would be a few examples of that?
So 1 second. I want to get so again. It's nuance, but so let's say like this. So names and addresses. So certainly a long time ago we read last week. The Rambam says that Meisim b'chol yom, the Rambam says, ba'arei hamayrev, that someone who's a meiser, you off him, you kill him. Now, there's a famous story that's brought down in many different places. I'll read it from here. But it says, there's a famous story with Rabbi Yosef ibn Migash, the Ri Migash, who's from the earliest Rishonim in Spain. And the way it's quoted is as follows. Well, Rabbi Yosef ibn Migash, hanoyach v'hamasun, whose personality was soft and patient, shetziva liskel meiser echad be'ir meishavai alisna b'yom kippurim shechalias b'shavas l'fnei tfilas ne'ilah. The Ri Migash was mitzaveh the Rimagash, who was calm and patient, was mitzaveh to stone a meiser on Yom Kippur shechal b'Shabbos before Ne'ilah. So, for example, that's a story. The Rosh's son, in his tshuva sefer called Zichron Yosef, the Rosh's son brings a story. It's a whole arichas tshuva, but he brings that ki hu gadlanu ki b'chaye harosh zal, and during the lifetime of my father the Rosh, hiskim im gedolei ha'ir, he was maskim with the gedolei ha'ir lahargoi, to kill a meiser el shenitva hashah, that they didn't catch the moment. Because of many instances of edus, because of many instances of edus and malshinas and mesira that this person committed. But they were working somewhat in tandem with the king, and the king was a child king, was a Yenuka, who wasn't passing any judgment at the time. And it's himself it didn't end up happening. But he says, my father and the dayanim of the town paskin like this, lamaisa, to do it. And Memela, he says, to the case he's being asked about, that he agrees that the tshuva that he was posed to ask about killing a meiser, he says, Shamati, that my father was okay with it, they paskin lamaisa to do it. It didn't end up happening in that case. But whoever does this, whoever's involved in killing a meiser, you're mishtadl b'harigasa, you're doing a great thing. You're mevar oisei ra. Now, there's lots of other like haskaras brought down in a klaliistic sense that about killing a meiser. The problem is that in most places where Jews lived, to have your name go down on a psak in writing that said, I die in so-and-so, authorized killing of so-and-so because he's a meiser, would land you in a lot of trouble, like it would today. If there was, if you had an email that said, with 23 dayanim, that said, we allow to kill so-and-so because he was a meiser, they get in a lot of trouble. So a lot of pratiistic psakim don't exist, meaning to find something written from a specific story where a dayan signed and said it's okay, it's very hard to find. The only one where there's a tremendous amount of documentation is the case of the Ruzhiner. So let's talk about that story. So the Ruzhiner, Yisrael of Ruzhin, is a Russian Rebbe. He's, let's call him Dar Revi of Hasidim, the fourth generation of Hasidim. He's a great-grandson of the Mizritcha Magid. He spawns a tremendous amount of Hasidic courts. What do you say? He lived, let's say 1780 to 1860. Like the beginning-ish of Hasidim, not an early Rebbe. He's a Einikal of Mizritcha Magid, which is a big claim to fame, Rabbi Avraham Malach and Mizritcha Magid. His children end up becoming the Sadiger Rebbe, the Syatin Rebbe, Bahusha Rebbe, Chartkiv, lots of them beyond splits into many. Before the war in Europe, Ruzhin and its courts was probably the second biggest Hasidus in Galicia after Belz. It was a very, very substantial Hasidus. The Vizhnitzer, the first Vizhnitzer Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, the first Vizhnitzer Rebbe, was the son-in-law of the Ruzhiner. The Ruzhiner was like an accepted tzaddik by all Hasidim. He's an accepted tzaddik by all Hasidim. It's a tremendous amount of courts. Eventually, his children end up in probably the biggest war in the Chassidish Welt with Rav Chaim Tzanz, and that's a huge thing. The Ruzhiner had a son who at some point left the fold, came back. It's unclear what happened, but the Tzanza was very upset with how the Ruzhiner's children dealt with their brother, and that turned into a huge fight, which is for a different time, and had a lot of spillover and a lot of peliotzes. But the Ruzhiner is a very, very main Rebbe. Now, in 1838, there's a fishing boat in the town of Ushitz that fishes out a body from the water that's badly mutilated, clearly beaten, and that has bricks tied around its neck and tied around its ankles. They fish this out, they bring it to the shore, they bring it to the police. Nobody knows who it is. Identifying by dental records didn't exist yet, and they don't know who the guy is. They bury him again because no one identifies him. No one stepped forward and said, this is ours, so they bury him again. Now, a few months later, someone, Yitzchak Kenigsberg, comes forward and he says, I know who it is. He says there's two Meisrim from Ushitz who disappeared. Ushitz is like a suburb of Lvov. They're, prominent Meisrim. He says there's Yitzchak Axman and Shmuel Schwartzman, two Meisrim who are missing, and this is Yitzchak Axman. This body that you pulled up is Yitzchak Axman. So they dig him up again. They dig up the body again, and he makes a positive identification. He says this is Yitzchak Axman. And Yitzchak Axman is a Meiser working out of the Lvov area, and he was obviously killed by the Jews. Now, the Russian government at that time was Tsar Nikolai I, a famous anti-Semite who hated Jews, tremendously. And he sent a special, I guess we would call it today, like a special investigation, a special prosecutor to the area of Ruzhin, which is the same area, to try to round up everybody who's responsible. And 48 Jews got arrested in this dragnet, got picked up. Amongst them is the Rav of the city, which was Rav Shmuel Auerbach. It's not Rav Michal Auerbach. He's an anikel of the Rebbe Reb Zusha. The Ruzhiner gets arrested. The Ruzhiner, they dealt with kid gloves a little bit, because first of all, he was wealthy, and he was a member of the Traders Guild, which afforded him a certain amount of power in the neighborhood. But eventually, the Ruzhiner gets arrested, and he sits in prison for 21 months, which is a pretty long time. Sits in prison for 21 months as all these 48 people are being investigated, till they mamish figure out every Rav and every Dayan who signed on and who agreed and who stood behind this psak, and the different, punishments that are handed out to each one of them. For example, Reb Michal Auerbach's Svarim, his entire library is confiscated and translated. They hired people and spent, it must have taken a long time, his entire library of Svarim is confiscated and translated to find every place that in a Jewish sefer it talks about Masira. Where it says, where the authorization for such a psak would come from. Now, they don't find any psak for this thing. The way that we know a lot of this involvement, strangely, ironically, is because of another Meiser. A famous Galiciana Maskell, a writer, Joseph Pearl, who became aware that in Galicia there was a huge fundraising operation going on to try for Pidyon Shvuyim for the Ruzhiner. All the Shtiblach and all the people who were affiliated with the Hasidim were raising tremendous amounts of money in Galicia to send back to Russia to be able to fight the case and to free the Ruzhiner and get him out. And Joseph Pearl compiled the list of every shtibel that was raising money and sent it to the Tsar's government to say, look, the Vaiter's still trying to think. Now, it happens to be that his Masira didn't make much difference to the case. That didn't really affect the case. And eventually, a bunch of the Jews get pretty serious punishments. Michal Auerbach gets sentenced to the Gulag, and on his way to the Gulag, people from the Kehillah break him out of the police car, and they spirit him away over the border, and he runs away. And he ends up in Poland. The Ruzhiner is eventually released without charges, probably due to bribery and lack of evidence, but no one would talk about the Rebbe. No one would say the Rebbe. The Ruzhiner was like a malach. No one would talk about the Rebbe and say the Rebbe. So the Ruzhiner, due to lack of evidence and a lot of bribery, was released without charges. But we have memos that were dug up today, from the Russian government's archives, that say, instruct the regional governor of Ruzhin, keep a good eye on the Ruzhiner, and the next time you find even the slightest excuse to arrest him or imprison him, pick him back up. We can't make this stick, but get him on something else. Find out the next time he doesn't pay a parking ticket and arrest him, pick him up again. The Ruzhiner becomes aware of this, and in the dead of night, he prepares his whole family and he sneaks away. And he moves a few times, but he ends up in Sadiger for 8 years, and then he moves again. But the Ruzhiner ends up leaving Russia and escaping due to this case. But this is one of the only cases that have a real, trove of documents about the Meiser. The name of the Meiser who was killed. Often the Meiser's name was never known. The people who killed him were never known, because this is all done very hashash. You wouldn't find a psak that talks about it. And over here we don't have a psak that talks about it, but we do have. They dug up today from I guess it's the Special Investigations Unit of Russia, which is available still. All these documents about this case, and we know a list of many Jews. We know that it was a bezdin of Chaf Gimel that decided to kill him. We know they were makbid to have a bezdin of 23 dayanim to authorize killing these Meiserim.
Did they find the other body?
No, they never found the other body, and whatever. And plenty of people sat in jail for this. So up to very recently, this is late mid 1800s. Last week we spoke about Margoli Siyam's father, which is late 1800s. After the shir last week, a lot of people told me that they say over there, Rabbi Isaac Osband, who was a Rav in Lita for 6 months after the war before he came to America, oversaw the killing of a Meiser in the town that he was a Rav in. Now, the question would be, what about Bisman Hazeh? What about Mamish Bisman Hazeh? Right now. So strangely enough, a lot of the literature on this comes from judges on the Israeli Supreme Court. Certainly in the early days of the state, and even some more recently, judges on the Israeli Supreme Court were somewhat Talmidei Chachamim who wrote on this. But I think we're going to have to hold that. There's stories of this. There's a shaila about extradition. There's a big fight with Professor Menachem Alon got into a big fight with other Rabbanim. There's an article, like a Maracha from Rabbi Yisrael Shapansky. Rabbi Shapansky from Mir Yeshiva, his father, was a big writer, a scholar. He has an article about this, and we'll get to Tzliaz has a true about it. We'll get to this. There's a piece from the Aruch HaShulchan that's very interesting about it, but updating it to really 2023. But that's for next week.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.